The following is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network.
It's the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. Jason Bryant here with you as always. News, reviews, previews, and interviews from the most notable names and topics in the sport of wrestling. Thank you for listening. Today, our guest is Jeffrey Marsh, the Executive Director of Beat the Streets and the national faction. We'll talk about the difference between Beat the Streets National and Beat the Streets New York here in a moment. First of all, Jeff, your second podcast appearance that I know of. I know you've made an appearance on the Blood Round podcast, but officially welcome to the Short Time Wrestling Podcast.
Thanks, appreciate it. It's third. There's one that hasn't been published yet.
I'm going to guess Michigan Grappler there.
No, actually, I haven't been on Michigan Grappler. I know those guys, obviously, from growing up there, but I haven't been on their podcast yet.
So what was the third one again? I didn't hear.
Third one is Wrestling is Life with Daniel McCune out in California.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm familiar with it as well. Yeah. As a matter of fact, that's a reminder that I need to update that on the podcast listing page at matttalkonline.com/directory. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge for you listeners that may be discovering this network for the first time. But Jeff's a Michigan native. It goes by Jeff, even though Jeffrey is on everything, has been spent time dabbling in the jiu-jitsu and the MMA world and the coaching world over at Edge in Hoboken, New Jersey, but is spending his days now with Beat the Streets and as formerly the national chapter relations coordinator, but now your title has come into executive director as far as the national role. So just in a nutshell, your position, day-to-day operations, what do you do in the bustling, bright, busy lights of New York City?
Yeah, well, besides fighting traffic, I think essentially day-to-day for me is my job's to learn from the experience of all the programs, whether it's New York, Philly, or LA, and to take and share that with some of our smaller programs. And then to take what our smaller programs are doing. For example, last week I saw a wrestling practice, youth development wrestling practice, that was the best kids practice I've ever seen in one of the smaller programs, and sharing that. So really building a culture of knowledge sharing, right? I think one of the limitations of our programs in the past is they all operated in these silos, and they weren't sharing, they weren't talking, not because they didn't want to, just didn't have the bandwidth to do it. So my job's to spread that information and help everybody improve.
When you talk about the wrestling in the silos, that seems to be what wrestling people have kind of been afraid of is, we borrow techniques from the others, but certain people that are like, don't want to share knowledge. And we've seen a better, intentioned coaches around the country. We've seen a lot with the USA Wrestling Coaches Education programs and whatnot. That why do you think there's been a shift now to sharing more information versus keeping those trade secrets close to the vest?
Yeah, I think to speak generally to wrestling, it's probably since 2011, 2012, or was it 13 when the sport got cut?
It was February of 13.
Yeah, so I think it's since then, and that's really, personally, that was the inspiration that kind of drove my passion to the next level too. But I think now we realize we're all in this fight together, and we can't kind of stay independently divided, and we've got to work together to be stronger. I think from a Beat the Streets perspective, there was a conversation I was having probably 3 years ago with Kira Berry, who's the president of the New York board. It was just over lunch, and I was discussing with her and said, if Yaru's doing this in LA for insurance and New York's doing this and Detroit's doing this, I said, where are they sharing? Where are they communicating? And she basically said, well, they're not. And, we saw that as, oh my gosh, it's super inefficient. You're wasting manpower because everybody's taking 2 to 3 weeks to solve that problem. And then somebody might have a better solution than everybody else and nobody's able to learn from it. So we realized that we could be more impactful, we could be more effective, and we could save our coaches and our staff a lot of time on administrative things if we work together so that they can spend time mentoring the kids.
When we look at the role of Beat the Streets in the sport of wrestling, we've got an event coming up on May 17th, which is really kind of put a bullseye on Manhattan specifically about what's happened. We've seen some great events there. We've seen an Olympic spot determined a couple years ago with Coleman Scott and Sean Bunch and that three-man wrestle-off for that spot at 60 kilos. We've seen the Russians. We've seen the Cubans. We've seen Kyle Snyder's senior debut. We've seen Jordan Burroughs' big-time international debut. When you look at the benefit which is now the title, the annual Beat the Streets benefit, which is coming up at Pier 17 Seaport, again on May 17th, the day before the World Team Trial starts out here in Rochester, followed by the gala. I mean, this is an event that really put Beat the Streets on the map nationally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you said, that really, that's the visibility. I think that's what's so incredible about it is we're able to use New York City to host this event, which really drives awareness for the sport of wrestling, right? And I think that's kind of one tier of what our program it does, right? Is it drives awareness for the benefits of the sport, both internally in a community, in an urban setting, but then also too on a national perspective through this event, through the benefit that we're holding next Thursday.
So with that benefit, we've got some big timers. Jordan Burroughs has loved putting this thing, basically putting on a show in this thing. I got him and Frank Chamizo, world champion, formerly of Cuba, now of Italy, and then of course, fresh off his recent. No, it's Jordan Oliver and Togrul Asgarov in another super match, and Mike Novogratz had leaked that one out, put that one out on Twitter, and you got a guy like Mike Novogratz, who really was kind of the driving force behind this Beat the Streets thing. What's it been like to work with Mike in these type of things?
Mike's great. He's a visionary that's able to get people behind his vision, right? I think that that's how Mike's able to be so effective, right? Even with the Chamizo Burroughs match. Well, him and Dave Barry were really the drivers that pushed to make that happen, and that was something Mike took on personally to make sure that it did come together for the 17th. So, it's awesome to be surrounded by not only Mike but the rest of our board of directors and everybody that's involved in the organization, because truthfully, they're people that get things done, and that's inspiring. And I think it's super positive for what's happening within the space of wrestling.
Unfortunately, the world of politics can sometimes enter the fray. We saw that with the World Cup in terms of Russia and the Islamic Republic of Iran not competing this year. And, the Russians have made trips to Times Square frequently during the course of the history of this event. Was it just basically say, we're not going to try to deal with this visa stuff. Let's bring in the Cubans. Let's bring in the Nigerians.
I wasn't involved as much on the actual discussion of what teams were going to come in. I think everybody sees it happen, but there really is there's an 8 to 10 month process that goes in behind that. Brennan, the executive director in New York, he handled that because it's their benefit. I share an office space with him. We sit side by side, but I think that's what kind of is misunderstood too. Exactly as you're saying, is the political side of things is, A, how can you use wrestling for solidarity? But two, who's going to come in and who's going to have the availability? And then who's going to ask an exorbitant price, right? Because the truth is that these athletes get paid through this event. And so some of the programs, they see the visibility of it in some of the countries, and they're driving for a pretty exorbitant fee. So, there's a lot of things that play in, especially as it's a benefit. And who's going to draw visibility, right? We want to make sure, as we've done Iran in the past, we've done Russia in the past, and those were both during times of political tension. Through some good partnerships, we were able to get those programs in when that might not otherwise happen in the U.S. and because of political tensions. And so that also is able to help generate some of that visibility for wrestling and for Beat the Streets.
You said you'd shared an office with Brennan Buckley, and you didn't mention Brennan fully by name, but he is the executive director of Beat the Streets New York, former head coach at Columbia, spent some time with Beat the Streets LA, and then came back to New York. All-American at Fresno State, and you wrestled at Michigan. You guys have any inter-office scraps there and show some technique at all?
I'm just trying to help him adjust his footwork a little bit. But no, so actually it's interesting. Brendan recruited me when he was coaching at Columbia University. He sat on my parents' couch in 2012 back in Michigan and was trying to get me to be a Lion. But unfortunately, I turned him down, and then I stayed in contact with him and Dave Esposito, and then built some relationships with some of the folks in New York. And he's part of the reason I actually ended up out here. So 14 years later, I guess 15 years later, I'm sitting side by side with him in the office.
I assume you meant 2002 instead of 2012.
Is that what I said? 2012?
Yeah, I'm going to bust your chops on everything you say wrong. No, it's funny because, and think as a side note, I can't hear the name Dave Esposito without thinking the full phrase Dave Esposito is at BAMF. So that's just kind of like it's an internet wrestling kind of, it's not necessarily a meme, but it's kind of been an ongoing joke that, there's a Facebook groups that used to say such things. So maybe you can search that out. I think I'm giving away one of Dave's trade secrets about his legacy and reputation. But every time I hear that name, it just brings a smile to my face because of the stories that accompany it. But when you go back to Michigan here, let's fill in some gaps between growing up as a 2-time state champion, going to the University of Michigan. having that connection with Coach Buckley as a recruiter, and then finding your way to New York City. Growing up in Dexter, Michigan, do you ever find yourself be like, man, I'm going to be working in New York City someday?
No, absolutely not.
Now, side note, are you going to be, how about this? Am I ever going to be working in New York City in wrestling someday? That's an even rarer type of thought process.
Yeah, absolutely not. No, growing up in Dexter, at that time, it's a bedroom community now at Ann Arbor, but at that time it was a farm town. And just to go to the University of Michigan was the biggest thing coming out of that town. And my horizons weren't even that broad. I was looking at going to school at Columbia and UVA, but Columbia, New York City, that was going to be a little bit too big. And then the way that kind of transpired is I got done with my wrestling career and finished up some school and was working in an office job and was commuting to an office park every day. And I was 24 years old, and I was just thinking to myself, this isn't it. And my mom always told me, she said, you're going to be a coach. You're going to do great things for wrestling. I see this. I have this vision of you. And she gets a little energetic. And so no. Well, I quit the office job about 6 months in. I just didn't go in, and sent him an email. Hey, it's not for me. And for a while, I was wondering, what am I going to do? And I've been out of wrestling for about 2 years, and Dave Esposito was starting up the Edge in Hoboken, and second location for him. And he didn't really have the time to run it. And I had some availability in my schedule. So I flew out and I checked out the space, and obviously I knew Dave and everybody involved. And I said, okay, I'm in. So with the hospitality that is Dave Esposito, I lived on his couch for 2 years. He didn't have the money to pay me. We had the facility. We had a dream and a vision, and we just built it. And now obviously it's a pretty successful facility, the one we have here in Hoboken, and Edge has a history of 102 state champions in New Jersey and over 200 kids in college. But just with perseverance and then Dave's support, we were able to really develop something. And I ended up in New York, and then started coaching UFC fighters primarily right off the bat, and coaching at D3 program, Stevens Tech, who's now become kind of a national powerhouse in the Division III level. And so I saw my passion shifting, and I saw it really shift in a way. When you're coaching at a high performance level, you're really only refining technique and mindset, competition prep. You're not really shaping lives to the same level that you are when you're working with kids. And that was where I saw my passion shifting in the last 2 or 3 years, and how I ended up here at the seat of Beat the Streets. Was that, really to make a major impact, we've got to make a major change in what's going on with youth sports and obviously with wrestling.
So tying all that together with Beat the Streets, the opportunity to take this position, I mean, what first made you apply? What was something that's like, yeah, this is something I think I can do? Well,
to be fully open, I got recruited about 3 years ago to apply for the New York position for the executive director in New York. And at the time, I didn't feel it was a fit. 2, because I felt like I hadn't completed what my other mission was. And, that was to get the Edge in Hoboken to a point of sustainability. And I had a goal I wanted to hit, and it wasn't done yet. And then the second thing is, so I actually didn't apply there. And about 8 months later, I found out that the chapter coordinator position was opening up, and it was part-time. So I could still do it while finishing up my other project. And so I picked up the chapter coordinator position. It was 10 hours a week. And, the passion continued to shift more and more towards youth development and just positive change in the sport and positive change for kids and through wrestling. And then when the position opened up, I'll be honest, I was still on the fence, and only on the fence because I've always driven my life to be ultra entrepreneurial. And that was something that was super important to me as an individual. And I didn't know if the fit was perfect. And so I knew the mission was perfect, but I didn't know if the structure was perfect, because I knew I'd quit that office job once before, right? And so then I applied on the last day. And the more I went through the interview process, the more I realized this is 100% entrepreneurial. It's everything that I want for my life and my career. And it was the right fit. So I think there was 108 applicants, and it came down to me and one other individual who had extensive nonprofit experience, which is, my biggest gap right now.
One thing it seems to me, though, is with Beat the Streets, you're looking at dealing with kids, a lot of them in middle school, getting into high school. So you look at the demographic of the age of you compared to the age of the parents of these kids, and it's not that far off. It's not like, parents are old to us anymore. I mean, I'm in my, dare I say it, late 30s, and I still view myself like I'm in my mid 20s. I realize, no, that's not the reality. I relate better to the parents than we do the kids these days. And you think that's actually kind of helped in trying to sell the sport a little bit more, because you're the age of your peers, the parents, and granted, kids may be there or not there, but you can relate to the parents based on shared experiences and such versus trying to explain it to a gray-haired parent versus one that's still got their hair, save Kevin Claunch.
Hey, mine's falling out too. That's why I have this weird haircut. Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, as I was shifting more towards into the kids coaching and away from the high performance stuff, I was relating less with the athletes that were competitive, and I was relating more with parents that wanted to shape kids' lives, and they wanted the best outcome for their kids. And that was what became the most important for me as a coach and as a person. And that's obviously what's most important for parents, is they want to see a great experience for their kids that's going to help them develop character. It's going to help them develop resilience, perseverance, and focus on goals. That's the important stuff in life. And that's where it's going to take a kid and let them transfer that out of wrestling and athletics and be successful off the mat. And so, yeah, I definitely am able to further connect with the parents and sell the sport on that because, well, frankly, I think it's what matters, and it's what parents care about too. I think driving that question as well is, I've always challenged how we marketed wrestling. And that was something that obviously through my social media page, the Wrestling Coach, was important to me and to what we're doing is just challenge wrestling. I see so many flyers that say, bring your kid in. We want the toughest, the this and that. Well, that's great. But the kid that really needs this the most, he's not going to sign up for that flyer. The kid that needs resilience and needs to be tough, he's the one that needs to be recruited on character development, discipline, focus, right? On creating a wrestling called mental toughness, but resilience or grit. That's the kid that needs wrestling more than those kids that are already super tough. Yeah, they're going to be successful competitors, but I want to change kids' lives.
In the time you've been in New York City, how much have you seen Beat the Streets change kids' lives?
Oh, it's incredible. It's amazing. We got a kid that walked into the office last week, and he hasn't been in school. And I'm just going to use him as an example. And he hasn't been in school in 3 months, and nobody could get a hold of him. Like, this is a reality. This kid has the ability to win Fargo, but he decided to stop going to school. So he walked into the office, and I saw him come in at 4:00. And I mean, it takes guts to walk into the office and admit your mistakes, right? But he's looking for a change. That kid is looking for something different. He's looking for something positive. He knows wrestling's that. And so I grabbed him and I stopped what I was doing for the day. And I talked to him for an hour, and a couple other coaches talked to him, and he was going to take off. And I said, "You're coming with me." So I grabbed him and I took him to a practice, and now we're focused on getting him an opportunity to wrestle at Fargo. He might not get that opportunity because we require some academic things from the kids. But that's the change that's important, right? And I think what's happened over the last 7 years that I've seen Beat the Streets in New York City is it's grown to be a fully inclusive community. Rather than just a bunch of wrestling and adding wrestling programs, it's become the epicenter of the wrestling community in New York City. And that's happening in other cities as well. But really, it's changed the landscape. New York City is a wrestling city now. Not to the level that some of us want it to be, but 7 years ago, if a kid came out of New York City and went to the New York State Championships and somebody had him first round, that they guaranteed a tech ball or a pen. Now our kids are competitive, they're placing, and they're getting into college. They're opening those doors. They're doing SAT prep. They're having those opportunities. I just saw a stat from the Beat the Streets New York program. 91 kids who wrestle more than 35 hours in our program per year have a 95% or above grade point average.
That's outstanding. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I mean, there aren't enough words to say how awesome that stat is.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And in wrestling, we've always kind of assumed this, but we never had the data to prove it, right? Well, when we have the data to prove it, now I can go to an administrator in Milwaukee and I can say, look, 95% grade point average for any kid that is in the program more than 35 hours. So he's going to help us with facilities. He's going to help us with equipment. He's going to do everything in his power to bring wrestling to that school.
one thing about New York City, people will look at it and be like, well, it's just one city. It's just one city. It's one of the biggest cities in the world. We're talking the population of New York City and the 5 boroughs and what people consider upstate, which is basically what Yonkers. No, geographically it's bigger than some countries. I mean, we're talking about you can say New York City's a wrestling city. New York City is an everything city. You can basically look at it and you can literally find anything you need within probably 3 or 4 blocks. Now, when we look at the melting pot, that's also New York City, the Crossroads of America. I remember going back there a couple years ago when I was hitting these events with USA Wrestling. Is we saw the kids in these exhibition matches with names like Aliyev, like from a kid wearing an Azerbaijan singlet who was actually part of the Beat the Streets program because his parents came from Baku. We have a true melting pot of wrestling cultures coming together, starting at like the middle school level. I mean, how cool has that been to see?
Oh, it's amazing. And even seeing within those communities, right? So exactly as you're talking, right? Brooklyn has a huge Eastern European immigrant community, and seeing that's become their wrestling identity and culture within that team. And then you go to Queens, right? And you've got Nigerian kids on the team there, and just the first generation kids that are wrestling in the programming there. And that becomes part of their cultural identity within their community as well. And seeing that further develop is super cool. Then you've got the kids from like a poly prep or some of these kids that come from the New York City private schools, and they're also part of the program because those kids need wrestling too. And just because those kids have parents who are affluent doesn't mean that their dad's not gone till 12 o'clock every night at work, right? That kid needs a mentor as well. And so seeing those kids, and then they're all coming together and they're going to Virginia Beach together. And 2 kids that never would have interacted, or 3 kids, a Nigerian kid, a Brooklyn kid from Dagestan, and a kid from the Upper West Side, all sharing lunch and traveling together and warming up together and interacting with each other and seeing that, hey, man, we're all the same and we're doing the same thing. That's cool.
You ever dial it back and look at some of the people that, we like to celebrate wrestlers, and there are a number of wrestlers who are big names outside of the sport now that we'd love to get back and bring back in. George Stephanopoulos is a wrestler who is a wrestler at Columbia. He's on TV every single morning on Good Morning America. Neil deGrasse Tyson has made science cool again. He's a New York City guy. Like, if this thing is 40 years ago, Neil deGrasse Tyson might have been a Beat the Streets kid.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's. Do you know of anybody that has a database of all those former wrestlers? That would be cool.
Dude, that's. I've got databases on databases. I think that is probably the impossible task because I'm trying to dig them out and put. I mean, I know like Chunk from the Goonies was a wrestler. I mean, stuff like that. We're trying to get. I think there's lists of NFL guys, and I know that I think the NFL draft there was a stat floating around that I think what was it like over 60-70% of the picks were multi-sport athletes. So. As far as a database of everybody who ever wrestled, no, don't know if I can get that for you. I know I can have.
I bet Leroy has something at the Hall of Fame, but
they've got a lot of lists there between there and the Gable Museum. I know that Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, is one that's high up on the list again since he's made science cool again for some people.
Yeah, and I think what would be really interesting, and I think it would be awesome to get some of these folks engaged on the cause. Neil deGrasse Tyson, that guy is the man. And getting some of these former wrestlers involved and engaged for Beat the Streets would be incredible, whether it's through some of the football personas or the football players or some of the celebrity personas. I think that's something we've done at a surface level, but we haven't been really intentional about it. And it would be super neat just to get some of these wrestling alumni in and not only at the New York City benefit, but in front of the kids.
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago. You brought Matthew Modine and Frank Jasper out, and it was like, hey, everybody knows Matthew Modine. And then I remember Noel going, and shoot, and it was like his name's Frank Jasper. He works out now. He's actually been on this show before, but bringing Ray Lewis coming in. I mean, things like that have really, I think, helped elevate the event beyond just our wrestling circles. And I was actually thinking about this today.
You heard Ric Flair's coming this week?
Woo! Really?
Yeah, woo! Yeah, Ric Flair's in. Oh, wait, maybe that's not public.
Well, depends on when this gets released. So we're recording on the 9th. It'll probably, you got a couple days on this. But as we talk about, man, I'm going to mark out so hard because, man, I grew up a pro wrestling fan. But as I was getting back to my thought, because as listeners of this show know, I can get very sidetracked and tangential thoughts and such, like the bird feeder outside my window and the squirrels. Anyway, but we're talking about what the role is. And we talk about promoting wrestling. Well, we're promoting wrestling. Beat the Streets is promoting wrestling to a broader audience. I understand. I am, for example, am promoting wrestling within a wrestling audience, trying to branch out. Mm-hmm. What is it like to know that every day you're going to encounter people that aren't wrestling people, and you have to constantly be an advocate for the sport of wrestling?
And I think it's the coolest thing. Maybe that's just my personal obsession with growing the sport and to accessing people outside of it. But I think it's the coolest thing when I can sit down with someone, whether that's a celebrity or a football player or a superintendent of a school district that doesn't have wrestling. And I can get that guy excited, or that individual or that girl excited about wrestling. That's amazing. There was an opportunity last year, Washington, D.C., a lady, Diana Parente. She came from New York City public schools, and she went to D.C., and she had seen the positive impact of Beat the Streets New York and the partnership that it had with the PSAL, Public School Athletic League. And she saw what it did for the kids. And so she went to D.C. and she started managing 115 athletic programs in their schools. And they had no wrestling. So she went to her chancellor, her funder for the district, and she said, we need to bring wrestling here. This year they have 8 programs. Next year they'll have 16. And then they're going to add wrestling to DC public schools in the third year on a bigger capacity. And so that's an advocate for wrestling now. And the only reason she's an advocate for wrestling now is because she got pulled into it through Beat the Streets and saw that positive impact. If I can take that experience that Diana had and I can give that to anyone, I think that's really the growth in the future of wrestling. And to me, that's really, really exciting.
So much of the Beat the Streets press is centered out of New York, but LA's hosted events, and we've had groups in Baltimore and Philadelphia also doing great things. And how many Beat the Streets chapters are there now, and what does it take to be a Beat the Streets chapter?
Well, do you think that the listeners want the long answer or the short one?
I guess the most relevant, perhaps. Maybe it could be somewhere in the middle.
Well, early on, there was a Beat the Streets USA program ran by Al Bivlaka. It was great. It got people excited and fired up. But the challenge was there was no follow-up. There was no systems. There was no support. And so people were able to start programs. And then if they were able to develop a strong board, they were able to build good programs. Some of those programs stopped and some of them ended. Some programs popped up and said they were Beat the Streets, and maybe they weren't. And so I think that now, if you look at the landscape, we have about 11 programs, and there's going to be 10 programs going through the accreditation process this year. So with that program before, anyone could start to Beat the Streets, and it would be like, I use this example, right? And this is from Clint Matter, one of the members of my board. He says, "Well, Jason, you start McDonald's, and you're running McDonald's out of New York City, and it's going great. You're slinging hamburgers, and you're making a great product. I come to you, and I want to start McDonald's in LA, and you say, sure. Here's how you got to do it. We shake hands, and you go off and you start slinging hamburger. I go off and I start slinging hamburgers in LA. Well, over the course of 5 years, a bunch of the hamburger joints pop up, and they're all called McDonald's, and your buddies open them. Well, then somebody in Florida opens one, and wait a second. Did he come to you and ask if that was okay? I don't think so. And all of a sudden, as you start talking about that, you realize that actually you've got a great system for putting pickles on. And I'm terrible at pickles. So I'm so slow at putting pickles on, it's slowing down my whole process. So I learned from your pickle system. And all of a sudden you realize I'm buying ketchup at a really affordable price, but you're not getting that same deal. So I hook you up with my ketchup vendor, right? And all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this is way better. So now we're sharing, right? And that's where we're at right now. But the challenge is that, yeah, you have to be an accredited program to Beat the Streets, right? You have to have a license for that. You got to have the membership for that. And sometimes because of the grassroots nature of it, individuals in certain communities that weren't connected to the brand, they just assumed that anyone could start to Beat the Streets. And they didn't understand that there was an accreditation process. And not because they meant to do it maliciously. It just that information wasn't public and it wasn't out there. And so my job is to make sure to get that information out there, let people know what the accreditation process is. And we have programs right now. There's 2 programs I'm in talks with that are doing youth development work. One of them has 5 programs on the West Coast. And another one has 13 programs on the East Coast. Well, they're not called Beat the Streets, but I guarantee they're going to be called Beat the Streets within the next 18 months because they're doing the right work. They've got the right systems. We can plug them in and help them grow with what we're doing. And they're going to go through the accreditation process. And that kind of really has been the truth of what's existed with Beat the Streets. Like New York City had the MWA, Metro Wrestling Association. Bill Crum and a couple other guys ran that. And they ran wrestling tournaments out of New York City. They didn't quite have the partnership with the PSAL. Al Bivlaka was able to secure that. And then Mike came in and founded Beat the Streets with Dean Colucci and Bill and Al. And Mr. Rinaldi. And so essentially then they were able to support and grow that, right? So there was pre-existing programs. And I think that's kind of been the assumption in the past, is that, well, it was always the first programs. Well, not necessarily. There was an infrastructure of supported. Same in Philly. They had the Police Athletic League, some community centers that the Matters went in and were able to support. And same in LA. Andy Barth went in and was able to build a partnership with community centers and brought the programming there. So there was pre-existing wrestling. It was just able to be scaled and grown then once it got Beat the Street support.
So when we look at the benefit and the gale of the companies that I remember, we were talking beforehand, the first one I attended was probably in 2006, and this was before wrestling was even part of it. It was a function at the Bowery. I got sideswiped by a taxi. I drove in from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was generally it was like I go in, I think I had $13 in my pocket, and I'm like, all right, well, I don't want to, I got a little bit of cash. I don't want to have to run around to the $5 ATM charge or whatever. I mean, I'm in like I'm moved away from home and I have a job and I'm pretty bad with my money. I'm like, all right, I'll just get one drink because I'm going to be driving back a couple hours. I'll just have a Jack and Coke. There went my $13. So I got sideswiped, and I had the most expensive Jack and Coke I've ever drank in my life. And I did get to hang out with Baumgartner and some of the wrestling people, but wrote a story out of it. But how this event has evolved and morphed. But I guess from the outside looking in, and you see big money guys like Dave Barry and Mike Novogratz that are involved in Beat the Streets New York. From the layman who doesn't know the difference between Beat the Streets New York City and the Beat the Streets national chapters, there might be some pushback. We're like, well, these guys have all this money anyway. Why do they need to do a benefit? Why do they need to do a fundraiser? So I guess can you put some of those questions to rest?
Yeah, well, I think in order to be sustainable, right? Sustainable means to last forever. That Beat the Streets funding needs to be diversified. And while Mike and Dave might be able to individually fund the programs, if their funding goes away, Beat the Streets New York goes away. And without being diversified and using the benefit to bring in a network of funds through other board members, through other major donors, other supporters, then Beat the Streets New York goes away. And that means 3,200 kids lose wrestling opportunities, right? And so while Mike was able to get the organization started off the ground, now we're looking at where we really need to diversify our funding. And for no other reason that we want this to last forever. And so that's the most important thing why we do the benefit is to draw in support from across the country. Plus, I think it's important too that it's a community-based movement, right? And whether somebody's donating $5, $50, a $25 ticket, or they're buying a $5,000 ticket to the benefit, it's community-based and it's fully engaged within the community, and that's critical too to just making this last.
And one thing, the business adage, sometimes you got to spend money to make money. The money spent on, I can just try to wrap my head around the permits to get anything in Times Square. I know that Mike's talked about that extensively, but infrastructure wise, New York City is not a cheap place to do anything in terms of rental spaces. It's a union town. I mean, there are a lot more costs associated with maybe the 3,000 kids you've got in New York than maybe the smaller Beat the Streets outfits that may just have a couple hundred at this point.
Yeah, Beat the Streets New York has roughly a $2 million a year budget. And all of that $2 million is spent on programming or staff administration there. And it is strictly watched by Shannon Smith. There are no extraneous expenses down to the dollar. And I think that our 990s are public and that's pretty clear, but every single dollar goes back into making the program better. In order to run this organization, there's 54 coaches that are supported within the high school programs. There's 42 coaches that are supported within the junior leagues. And this is New York City alone. And they've got over 103 programs this year that they're supporting. Well, you're talking about coaches' stipends for 103 programs. You're talking about equipment for 103 programs, T-shirts, shorts, shoes, headgear for the kids, right? We've got some partnerships with some great companies, Cliff Keen, Resolite support in New York City this year, Dahlinger supported LA. We've got some really good opportunities as far as partnerships, but that costs a lot of money to keep these kids wrestling. And it can't be all supported by one or two individuals. And I think that's one thing that sometimes we try to make clear, but it's not particularly. Even as you said, running a $2 million organization, that's a full-time job for Brendan. That's a full-time job for Shannon, who manages the office. And And to keep that program sustainable, we need a communications director, because that person's communicating with not only public marketing, but you're talking about communicating with, again, 103 different programs. So just the scheduling, the coordination, and everything that goes into that. And that's not even getting all the way down to the permitting yet. It's a lot of work to run these programs. And in order to do that sustainably, it costs a lot of money.
I want to dial it back, and I don't want to sound like a shill here, but I do have a story that I want to explain regarding one of the business ventures I was in 2009, one that brought me here to Minnesota for the first time. It was called Wrestling 411, and it was basically the idea was trying to be a sports center for wrestling, and it was a little ahead of its time. It's funny because the things I'm doing now with the Mad Talk Podcast Network are very similar to what Kyle and I were doing then, but we were donation driven in a lot of ways, and we had to reach out. And Mike Novogratz was one of those early contributors, and we were at the World Championships in Denmark in 2009, and we're he had actually paid to keep this restaurant open so people from USA Wrestling could have a place to eat. The fans could, and the training partners could actually get some, because everything in Herning, Denmark closed at like 8 p.m. I mean, it was basically a clean, very clean, expensive Danish town, and nothing stayed open. So Mike made sure that these places did stay open because they were going to get our business. And I was having a conversation with him, and I'm like, hey, Mike, I really appreciate, the contributions to Wrestling 411, because at that point, I'm freelance for USA Wrestling. This thing is dead it's dead in the water. I'm going to figure out what the heck I'm going to do with my life after moving out here on an island, knowing two people. So when I'm talking to Mike about this, I say, I think, and it's and we got to talking about fundraising. He goes, you know what? He says, man, I'm paraphrasing here, but he talked about how much money he had, and he talked about, his time in, flying helicopters. But he goes, you know what? I don't think it's right for wrestling to rely on just a couple people. And here's how he said it. He says, if we need to raise $500,000 for something, I don't need to be on the hook for $490,000 of it, and the rest of the wrestling community raised just the remaining 10. It seems like his mentality is, hey, you know what? You come to the table with something, I'll match it. And I don't want to put those words in his mouth, but it's that type of mentality that seems to go with what you were just saying. So that's one thing I remember that conversation with Mike. Is like, well, it made a lot of sense. It's like, wrestling people can kind of be like that. Well, somebody else will pay for it. People complain about the Flow Pro subscription, which is $12 a month. It's a couple Cokes, and maybe you'll get rid of one of your vices. You can pay
City
for
Jack and Coke.
Yeah, New York City Jack and Coke, exactly. One of those a month. I mean, in my case, I've quit dipping for almost 2 years now. That's a couple cans of chew. That's stuff that we don't necessarily need, but we're complaining about $3 for Intermat a month. We're complaining about every little thing wrestling people make. So that issue kind of sticks to me a little bit. So I just wanted to get that little story out. It really may not have a whole lot of relevance to the broad spectrum of Beat the Streets, but it kind of goes to the fundraising mindset that can exist. And I think wrestling folks just need to understand that sometimes we need to step up as people too, because as you said, if Mike and Dave and these people in their respective places go away, thousands of kids lose wrestling.
Yeah, completely. And I think looking at it too is exactly as you said. If I skip a coffee for a week, that's going to be $40. That's $40 I can send to Baltimore. That's $40 I can send to Lancaster, right? And looking at it as that. And like you said, I think Mike. So it's interesting you said the match piece. I actually have a match it's about to launch on the social media page this week. Mike committed to match $25,000, up to $25,000, dollar for dollar. So every dollar that we can raise for Beat the Streets National, Mike's going to match it with the idea we want to build out curriculum, right? We want to take the systems from New York City, LA, Philly. We want to make them better, and we want to get it to Lancaster and Baltimore and Providence and Detroit and Chicago. And so it's exactly that. Look, if you raise it, I'll match it. And that's motivation that you don't sit back on your laurels and say, okay, well, this is going to be funded. Because that's dangerous when you sit back on your laurels and say something's going to be funded. You take things for granted and you're not working on getting better. And I think that, that's the wrestling mindset, right? We're always working on getting better. And we've got to apply that, I think, to philanthropy. I think everyone in wrestling looks at donations can kind of sometimes feel a little bit, I don't know, I don't want to say dirty, but philanthropy is awesome. Right? Mike's a philanthropist. I'm a philanthropist, right? My brother's a philanthropist for this fundraiser I'm about to do. Philanthropy's cool. And I think that's the attitude that if we have in wrestling is, hey, this is a philanthropy that I can give to. I was in a conversation last year. UWW was looking for a partner because the International Olympic Committee is looking for a cause behind the cause of Olympic sports. And UWW was considered partnering with PETA. They were considering partnering with the World Wildlife Foundation or Fund. And then they realized, wait, we've got a philanthropy in wrestling, and that Beat the Streets. And so we had a conversation. Didn't go anywhere yet. But the idea is that, yeah, Beat the Streets is wrestling's philanthropy. This is wrestling's good cause. And not only is it helping the kids in the program that need it. Last week I was with a kid in Chicago, and he hadn't eaten since lunch the day before. We didn't know that. He was starting to get grumpy. He was getting a ride home from a tournament, and a bunch of kids in the car, and he hadn't eaten since the day before. He was getting grumpy. We had no idea why. Right? No mom at home. Just hadn't eaten. But so obviously that's important. But at the same time, this philanthropy grows the sport that we all love. Right? New York City had 23 wrestling programs. They have 103 wrestling programs almost 10 years later. Same thing with Philadelphia. Right? I think Philadelphia had 13 programs. Now they have 31 programs. And LA as well. LA has been able to add almost 20 wrestling programs. So it does two things, right? It changes the lives of the kids in the program. But the philanthropy also grows what you and I love.
You mentioned UWW and it's worldwide. Beat the Streets is there. It's within wrestling. It reminds me of the story that ran in the New York Times back around NCAA tournament time about the wrestling culture in Dagestan and how wrestling is keeping those kids from basically being blown up in some cases because it's an area of domestic and international strife. I mean, you got wrestlers from Dagestan populating rosters of countries worldwide, and wrestling is what's keeping them away from fighting, these skirmishes, these little wars and things that outbreak in the Russian Republic. So yeah, it is global.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, it's global. I heard a story. There's a lot of conflicting stories about what the first Beat the Streets program was, but I heard a story about a program in the 70s in Rochester, New York, and they literally would go outside of the middle school and they would see the kids fighting, and the kids that were fighting, they would grab them and take them into the wrestling practice. I think that's the focus of underserved or at-risk kids, and that's the change that's really possible through the sport. When I look at Beat the Streets, and for anybody that's kind of newer to what the organization is, there's the confusion, as we talked about earlier, between it being a really cool wrestling match or being a program that keeps kids out of gangs. Right. And that's really what it is. And exactly what you're talking about with the Dagestani kids. They're either going to join the gangs, aka ISIS, or they're going to join a wrestling program. And same with the kids in the communities that we serve. Right. After school gets done at 3:00 and their parents aren't home till 6, 8, 10, maybe never. These kids, what are they going to do? They're going to hang out on the street corner, or they're going to get recruited, or they're going to get recruited to a wrestling program. Right? They're going to find their friends there. They're going to find their community there. They're going to find their goals there. Both of those are provided in either the gang or in the wrestling program. Community, goals, togetherness, right? Just depends on which option they're going to have access to. Most kids in urban settings, the other option has a lot more accessibility just because there's not wrestling everywhere.
I also want to go back to you talking about the makeup of New York with the Eastern European community in Brooklyn and so on. Is you look at the schedule for the benefit on May 17th. You start with youth matches, then you go to the PSAL, the Public School Athletic League Girls Dual Meet Championships, then you get into the dual meets and the super matches. Is there how do these kids get selected for like the youth matches? Is this an incentive that, or is it looking for a broad-based representation? I mean, this has got to be something these kids want to wrestle in, having known about it for a couple of years at this point.
Yeah, completely. I think, looking at the first round of matches is Ken Bigley, who was a previous programming director in New York City, and now he works full-time for the PSAL. He makes those selections, and he works closely with Jamie Gray and Penn Gottfried and Jackie Davis, our girls coach, on understanding what kids have met certain criteria, because it's an honor. And obviously we try to get representation from the different boroughs. So coaches can nominate kids, we look and see if they qualify to some of the standards. And those standards are not wrestling based. They're academic based. They're merit based. They're attendance based on how much time they've spent in programming. And then there's a selection made from that. And so there's a selection committee that does that selection. And that's for all the different kids that get to compete. And even our other programs, if you look at the roster, there's kids competing from Baltimore, Chicago. There's kids competing from Sandy Hook Elementary School this year.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Brennan opened up 2 of the slots for kids from that school to compete. So they'll be coming down and getting the opportunity to have something positive. And so those kids are also part of a nomination committee. So we allow programs from across the country that are Beat the Streets programs to submit their kids. And then obviously this year we opened the door to Sandy Hook. And then the selection is made by the same selection committee based on the matchups of the kids that are selected initially from New York City.
And from a fan perspective, this is something that's always been kind of donor focused. And then, if you get there early enough, you can kind of hang around and get a view. This year, tickets are being sold to the general public, new location. So in logistics, I know you said earlier that you weren't involved in all of the planning, but just from an idea perspective, why the change location? Why opening the doors? Obviously that's a good thing, but why opening the doors to the general public here for a reasonable fee?
Yeah, 100%. So if you had been to the New York City Times Square event before, general public viewing, while free, was a challenge. And if you didn't get a fence row seat, you were getting bumped by traffic. Everybody that wasn't a wrestling fan was trying to view. So it was great for visibility for wrestling. But I think for the actual fans, it was a challenge to get to view. So having the new venue, it's going to be a way better viewer experience for anybody that's coming that purchases a $25 ticket. And I think it's going to create a little bit more of a wrestling-specific, inclusive atmosphere, which is going to be neat. It's on the waterfront overlooking Brooklyn. It's underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. The venue is going to be great. And I think it's going to be better for the actual fan experience as far as attending it. Obviously, there's some trade-offs, like I said, with the visibility being lost that it has in Times Square. But it's still going to have good visibility as there's a lot of foot traffic that goes through the South Street Seaport.
Yeah, and what's amazing is I don't have the lifestyle to enjoy Manhattan more than maybe once a year. And, thankfully, Dylan Wanagale and the crew at Madison Square Garden brought me in to announce the Grapple of the Garden the last couple of years. So I've had the opportunity to really get to know parts of Manhattan, and buddies of mine know the little side streets and the places to eat and the speakeasies. But from somebody from Dexter, Michigan, what was the biggest culture shock of you into not just New York City proper, but Manhattan as a whole, because that island has so many things going for it?
Totally. I think the biggest culture shock was a $13 Jack and Coke.
Oh, man.
That, one of the things that Dave Esposito had was a relationship with a bar. And my first pay for my first year, he gave me 400 drink tickets. And so that was part of my pay. And 400 drink tickets in New York City, you're talking about $4,000. So as a 24-year-old, that was pretty good.
Moderation is the key to everything, my friend.
Oh, I'm not saying I used all the that first year. I think I still have some.
Hey, I spent 7 years in college. I need to practice what I preach. So.
Oh, you did too?
Oh, yeah. State school. But I was an undergrad. I was 7-year undergrad. So,
Yeah, me too. I think the biggest realization was when I got to New York City was that people that are from New York City don't actually spend time in Times Square.
That's,
like you said, they spend time in the neighborhoods and in the boroughs, and where the activity is a little bit less, and you avoid going to Times Square at all costs. That's where obviously the tourists are driven to, but and the South Street Seaport is one of those little neighborhoods that I didn't discover for probably 4 or 5 years after living out here. I rode my bike through and I was like, this is great. Historic, little kind of charming, off the beaten path. And it's becoming more of a tourist area now, but and it kind of always has been, but it's really starting to get ramped up. And it's one of those little neighborhoods that are pretty neat.
Yeah, I think the two of my favorite spots, and actually 3 of them, one is a speakeasy, one is Madison Square Garden, and the other is the B&H audio, photo, video warehouse, the
right,
showroom
from MSG. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I've got this catalog now, and yes, we're in an age of digital, but I have the analog. I have the actual hard copy of their 300. Let me see how many pages this thing has. So 325 page quarterly catalog for B&H photo and video. This thing, I get most of my equipment, whether it be for my PA announcing microphones like my Shure SM58 or my Shure Classic 55, or my soundboards, or if I even need, their Black Friday deals are amazing. So I remember going in there the first year I got to announce the Grapple of the Garden, and I'm sitting there and I look at the back of the room key at the New Yorker, and it was like 10% off B&H, and I'm like, where the heck is this? And I just click. It's a block away. Oh man! So B&H, I could probably spend my entire year's paycheck in that store in about an hour. So that is one place. Of course, everything about Madison Square Garden. I love being a general sports fan. This past year, I actually tell the story quite often now that it's happened. So I get in for the meeting for the Grapple of the Garden. It's on a Sunday. So Saturday I get in, and they hook me up with fifth row seats at Kentucky Monmouth college basketball. I mean, I'm spitting distance from Calipari, so I can see what's going on with the college basketball. Then we go have our meeting. Scott Casper comes in from Takedown. We're both going to tandem announce the event. Then by that time, changeover's done. So then we go to the Devils-Rangers game that night. Then after that, it's over. Dylan Waniga walks us through the doors down to the theater where the Lomachenko fight is going on. And then 12 hours later, I'm announcing college wrestling in that very same facility. So there it is, one building, two venues in that building, 4 different sporting events in less than 24 hours. I mean, you can do anything in New York. And what I love about this is we bring it all full circle. There's seems to be no shortage of places kids can wrestle in New York as well.
We're definitely working on that 100%.
All right, I want to switch gears and finish things up with some more Jeff Marsh here. University of Michigan, your alma mater. You were an NCAA qualifier back in 2008 for the Maize and Blue. Your coach, Joe McFarland, recently retired. Let's just, you're looking back at your wrestling career. You didn't hit the podium, but you had the opportunity to compete at the show. What are some things that you learned from your experience at University of Michigan, and maybe Coach McFarland specifically, that you take with you to work every day?
Yeah, absolutely. I think perseverance, right? There was a couple of times when I was behind some guys who were pretty competitive for 3 years. Both of them won a few national championships, Mariah Bertine and Steve Luke, and looking at those guys and understanding what they were doing to be successful. And my first 3 years, I wasn't doing that. And McFarland was making it clear to me, but I didn't understand it. And I didn't understand it till I lost the opportunity to wrestle in the Big Tens my junior year. And then I made a shift in my life and a shift in my focus. And that's something that I think allows me to relate to kids better. I think it allows me to relate to kids that aren't doing the right things. They might think they're doing the right things, but I can really understand what it is to shift your mindset and your focus to be 100% in on something. And part of that came from McFarland making it clear and making some decisions that led me to that. And from Mark Torella and some guidance that he was able to give me kind of behind the scenes as well and be a pretty good mentor for me.
Any of those things that you talk to the kid? I mean, how much interaction do you have with the kids, and how many opportunities do you have? I mean, you mentioned the young man that came in and hadn't been to school in 3 months, and those lessons that you learn from college. And now that you're an adult, for lack of a better term, because in college you're adults, but you're not an adult. How many of those lessons do you try to push through to the kids about changing it up and being able to shift the focus?
Oh, every day. When the young man walks into the office, I know that he doesn't need to be told, hey, where you been? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? He's coming there because he's looking for something, right? Like I said earlier, he's looking for compassion. He's looking for support. He's looking for guidance. He's not looking to be ground out where you been. He's getting that at home. He's getting that at school. That's why he's not going, right? And to be able to take, and I can understand that because I've been in a situation before where, I wasn't always making the right decisions and I was getting ground in that direction. And, I was fortunate. I was a pretty motivated and smart kid, but I wasn't always putting my motivation into where it needed to be. And because of that, I had some hard lessons, and I can understand and relate, I think, and hopefully give the kids what they need. And I think that's important to being a good coach and mentor.
Finishing up with Jeff Marsh, the executive director of Beat the Streets. As far as the national organization goes, we've got a lot of information about the upcoming Rumble on the River. That is the official name of the benefit this year. The gala follows at the Pier 17, the Seaport at Pier 17, Manhattan, New York City, May 17th, streamed live on Flow Wrestling. If you've got a Flow Pro subscription, you can check that out. Of course, information at btsnyc.org. And Jeff, where else can they track your progress or more things from Beat the Streets online, whether it be social or the website proper?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got the new national website, beatthestreets.org. We don't have a social presence. We keep that focused on our groups. But beatthestreets.org, we've got we're about to launch one of our major fundraisers of the year. It's going to coincide with the New York benefit. As my social media presence, the Wrestling Coach, which you can find on Facebook, that's a lot of Beat the Streets driven content as well, and a lot of youth development content. So it aligns with our mission here. And we're about to do a major fundraiser where I actually cut my now, I guess, famous ponytail.
Oh, I see. I was thinking it was the only pictures we've got of you, at least from the edge, where you've got a short, close crop haircut and a giant beard. So
you got to see the back.
Okay, so you were partying the back the whole way.
Partying the back the whole way. Yeah, I was hiking the Inca Trail, and I was going bald, and I saw a guy getting a haircut, and I said, "That's a cooler way to do this." And he had a shaved head with a ponytail, and I said, "Yep, that's it."
I'm trying to think which pro wrestler did that. You're going with the younger Jake the Snake Roberts look.
I have no idea who that is, but
Steven Seagal. How about that?
Yeah. So yeah, we're gonna do a big fundraiser for Beat the Streets. It's gonna be all over the internet in the next week or two, and the goal is to raise the money to be able to help support expansion of wrestling and expansion of programs, and opening the door for more of these opportunities.
All right, and as we say that, I went to beatthestreets.org. I clicked the donate button as we finish this up. So here comes my $100. Doom. And if we get a couple thousand people to listen to the show and do the same thing, you'll be ahead of the game with the national fundraising.
We would be in a great spot. That would be incredible. Thanks for the visibility on that, Jason, and thanks for the support.
Jeff Marsh, Beat the Streets. We'll see him down the line. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Take care.
Well, by now, as you listen to this on its release date of May the 14th, 2018, yep, the secret's out. The Nature Boy is coming to Beat the Streets. Of course, Jeff talked about this as recorded it prior to heading on vacation. Yes, I went on vacation. I spent 5 days. 5 days. So Thursday, actually, I turned off the computer Thursday. Didn't turn it on again until Monday morning. That's like the longest I've actually turned off this computer since I've owned it. So I didn't do any of the curation of the newsletter because it was my 8-year anniversary. My wife and I went down to Texas. I left the kids with the in-laws and my in-laws. Well, her in-laws live in Virginia. That's a different story entirely about geography. But headed down to Texas and I had some of the best shrimp and grits you'll ever. Oh, I know you don't listen to this show for my food takes, but trust me, at 250 pounds, I am a connoisseur of craft beer and food. And I had and being from the South, shrimp and grits is kind of like my thing. I make a dynamite cheese grits in the morning. I actually make a really, really good cheese grit souffle, which is something else completely different, but still the same general concept. But shrimp is like my seafood among seafoods. There is it's like Bubba Gump. You could do it so many different ways, and shrimp is one of the things I have to be very careful with in how much I eat, or else I'm going to be walking funny. If those of you get the gout reference there, but we're looking at the place called the Gumbo Diner in Galveston, which is right on Seawall Boulevard or Seawall, whatever the name it is. It was, so good. So good. Fat man happy. So, took some time away from wrestling as a whole. Didn't read a whole lot. I played around on Twitter a little bit, did some Instagram and some Snap Face or whatever you kids are calling it these days. And I didn't do any curating. And, so yeah, no news curation over the last couple days, even though some of the bigger news items will be on the Daily Wrestling Newsletter, which we'll pick back up as we release this today again, May the 14th, 2018. You can sign up for that at MadTalkOnline.com/news. 1,000 of you are getting that each and every day for free. Okay, so each and every day that I'm not going on vacation or I'm not like traveling overseas somewhere. Other things coming up, we got the World Team Trials. We got Beat the Streets on the 17th. The World Team Trials final bit down in Rochester. I'll be down there on the microphone, having a good old time down in a great town of Rochester, Minnesota. The great wrestling city of Rochester. I don't know. I'm almost borrowing Greg Warren's like old person voice. That's really. I'm actually wearing a Stalling Brothers shirt today. Wrestling shirt today is over. but I am wearing the Stalling Brothers wrestling camp shirt today as I work through a little bit of a minor shoulder injury. I'm not really sure what it is. I just know it hurts, and then when you take a bunch of ibuprofen so it doesn't hurt so bad, then you're like, all right, I can build stuff. I've actually started woodworking, and when I say woodworking, I mean building stuff. I have saws, power tools. Power tools. Yeah, my entire garage is decked out in like Ryobi green. So I was rocking out the miter saw yesterday, cutting out some slats, and building basically a fence to the backyard that's going to keep kids from falling in this hole that is my walkout basement. Anyway, again, you don't subscribe to this show to hear my takes on food or my takes on home improvements and DIY and how many trips to Home Depot you take. You do listen to it for wrestling news, reviews, previews, and interviews, and that's the reason I'm so glad to do this show each and every week. We got some good stuff coming through the pipe. Again, Kevin Emily was a fantastic interview last week talking about his books, Pathfinder Volume 1 and Volume 2. Again, you can check that one out at mattalkonline.com/Kevin Emily and get those books at optionalstart.org. Women's wrestling news is going to come up on future shows with Joan Fulp and Andrea Yamamoto. Danny Irwin, haven't forgotten about you. You're still in the queue. And we are working on getting the athletic director at Truman State University on this program to talk about the cut of that wrestling program and another sports program and what they're doing in Missouri to try to save it and what information, good and bad, has been floating around about Division II Truman State. We've spent a lot of time on Eastern Michigan, and we've spent, they obviously haven't spent a lot of time on us because Scott Weatherby and his staff basically denied any interview requests to man up and go on the record and answer these questions. And since then, they've just basically been trolling the rest of us with, oh, congratulations to our athletes that we cut. We hate you. We suck as people. That's all I got. I really don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much because I'll get pretty fired up, and sometimes I can move over to that realm of being somewhat unprofessional here, and I don't want to do that. That being said, I'd like to thank you for spending your time with me and listening to each and every show. And that's not quite the tagline yet I want to throw out there, but if you do listen to each and every show, or you listen to a lot of shows on the network, you can contribute at mattalkonline.com/join the team or mattalkonline.com/contribute. You can do a one-time contribution, or you can make it a monthly thing, and with that monthly thing, you'll get some swag bags headed your way. Shirts, hats, draft glasses. I think I'm actually going to go away from the pint glass and go with the mug this year, so new ones are going to get the beer mug versus the pint glass. I'm just going to mix it up. Might go back to the pint glass with a different color later. But yeah, mattalkonline.com/contribute, mattalkonline.com/join the team. That's how you can help out the network and the program. That's all I got for you for today. I'd like to thank you for spending your time with me because you've always got time for short time. Woo! The Short Time Wrestling Podcast is proudly outfitted by Compound Clothing. Shirts, singlets, custom gear orders, everything you need. Call up Cliff and the crew at cmpteamwear.com. First time listening? Well, you can change that by going to mattalkonline.com/getshorttime to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or listen on your favorite podcatcher at mattalkonline.com/listen.
This show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to mattalkonline.com.